Hi, it's Brian Smith with Risk Reconnaissance. And of course, you know that I'm with the Insurance Office of America out of Atlanta. And I focus on government and defense contracting. And today what I want to do is to bring up a very simple topic for you, at least to us. And that's about general liability. Joining me today, we have Lloyd Humphrey. Lloyd is the Senior Vice President and Managing Partner for the Mid-Atlantic office with the Insurance Office of America. Lloyd, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Brian, it's good to be here with you today. Thanks for the invitation. I think general liability is often misconstrued as being a coverage that is overlooked because most people don't experience general liability claims unless you are a contractor. And in that case, you very well may have had or will experience a loss in the general liability arena. However, the general liability provides a lot of protection for businesses, and it does it in a pretty comprehensive way. And to understand how that policy dovetails into the needs of different organizations, I think is an important part of any conversation you can have around general liability.
Well, when we're talking about it, I know that it covers, like we call it, property damage and bodily injury. But when you think about it in terms of what a customer or client might think, how would you explain that to them?
I think I'd start by mentioning to a client that the general liability policy is designed to cover, and again, depending on what it's being written to do, but it's generally designed to cover the premises and operations of an organization. So that could be where you actually reside as a business, the building you reside in, and it could be the operations that you conduct as a business. That may be something in the construction arena. It could be in a service arena, but that's the operations side of the thing. And the general liability policy, as you mentioned, is a bodily injury and property damage policy, meaning that in order for the policy to be triggered to provide coverage, it needs to involve an event that creates either property damage or bodily injury. And that's where a lot of people get confused and lost sometimes because they think that it covers all of the things that they might do. So that might raise a question right there. Think about it this way. If I'm a HVAC contractor and I go in and install new equipment and the equipment causes, let's say I place a unit inside the attic of a building or inside the crawl spaces above an office building, and for some reason it's not properly supported and it falls through the ceiling. That's a property damage claim. And if it happens to fall onto anybody, that's a bodily injury claim. However, let's use that same contractor who installs the equipment and then the equipment fails to do what it was designed to do, which is to cool or heat the facility. There's nothing wrong with the equipment. It hasn't caused property damage or bodily injury. It just doesn't do what it was designed to do. That is not going to be covered by the general liability policy. What you have to remember is there's other policies that may be able to provide that type of coverage, but the general liability policy must have that trigger of bodily injury or property damage. The only exception to that, Brian, as you probably are well aware, and that is under the section of the policy that we call personal injury and advertising injury, which is often confused with what lawyers call personal injury. They refer to personal injury as injury to a person. We refer to personal injury in the business as an event that involves libel, slander, false arrest, illegal search and seizure, illegal detainment, and or advertising injury where I falsely or inappropriately use somebody else's advertising information. So they're the things that we can talk about that go into the bodily injury, property damage, or non-bodily injury, non-property damage section of the general liability policy.
What are some of the exclusions that our audience needs to be aware of with regard to general liability?
There's basically 4 places in the general liability policy where you get your coverage. Those 4 places come from either the insuring agreement, the exclusions, the conditions of the policy, or the endorsements that are attached to the policy. And remember, when I attach an endorsement to the policy, I am modifying some section or sections of the policy, but that endorsement, whether it's to exclude something or to include something, does not eliminate the application of other sections of the policy. So you have to be careful whether or not that endorsement is doing something to enhance or detract from what coverage is already available. So if I look at those 4 sections in relationship to a claim, I can pretty much get to whether or not I do or don't have coverage. You have 17 exclusions in your policy. 11 of those exclusions have exceptions to the exclusion. So if you want to use a couple examples that are easy and people might be able to relate to effectively, let's talk about one of the first exclusions, which is expected and intended injury. If I expect and intend to injure somebody, the policy is not going to pay any coverage or any claims. However, there's an exception in that. And that exception is if my expected and intended actions were to protect persons or property from injury or damage. So then the policy gives you back coverage if you were trying to protect persons or property. So let me give you an example. So if one of my employees' ex-husbands comes into the office and says, Denise, I have had all I can take of you. I'm done with you. And he pulls out a club and he starts in her direction. I'm going to get in his way and he's probably going to end up very hurt because I'm going to hit him multiple times. I expected and I intended to not only hit him, but I could fully expect and intend for him to be hurt from my hitting him. But I was protecting persons and property. However, let's use the next example. He comes in and he's just being extremely aggressive, and I get in front of him to keep him from coming any further, but I don't really try to hit him or touch him in any way. But he comes forward and he runs into me, and I'm kind of a big guy, but when he runs into me, he loses his balance, falls over, hits his head on a table, and he's now unconscious with a concussion. I expected to confront him and stop him. I did not intend for him to fall over and hit his head on the table. So that's an example of expected and intended. Let me take another one. Contractual liability. Everybody thinks and reads their contracts that says you'll provide contractual liability as part of the contract. Contractual liability is one of the primary exclusions in the general liability. Let's start with the fact contractual liability is excluded. So how do you get contractual liability in the policy? You've got to get it because there might be an exception to the exclusion. And when you sign a contract, there are several ways inside the GL that signing of that contract and the general liability policy can provide for contractual liability. And if it falls inside of one of those 6 items of exceptions, you will get coverage under the general liability policy. I should say 2 exceptions and 6 definitions of what qualifies as a event that can be insured for contractual liability. The simple contract that most people sign, most of the provisions are provided for in the general liability policy, exception to contractual liability exclusion. Keep in mind that when you sign a contract, Brian, that contract has an indemnity agreement in it that usually reads, you will indemnify, hold me harmless for any and all claims, damages, losses, costs whatsoever. Something along those lines. Your general liability policy simply says, we will pay on your behalf for bodily injury and property damage, not nearly as broad as what you just have in your contract, and to which the insurance applies, meaning that if we've got an exclusion in the policy, you've got no coverage.